dirt is more than just soil. It's a stubborn record of every mistake we've ever made. The town veterans mocked Sophie for leaving her 20 acres wild, calling her a dreamer who didn't know the first thing about farming. They were right, until the sky ripped open, the earth turned into a river, and the laughing stopped cold. Sophie stood in the doorway of the machine shed, staring at the John Deere 4020. Attached to its rear was the moldboard plough her father had bought used a decade ago. Its curved steel blades were dull, caked with the dried, pale dust of last year's harvest. She didn't touch it. She left the heavy metal sleeping in the shadows, walked out into the blinding April sun, and pulled the shed door shut. The wood groaned on its hinges. The metal latch fell into place with a hollow clank. That sound was a period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. Her father, Arthur, had died in November. He was a man who believed in the gospel of the plough. He believed that if you ripped the earth open, exposed its dark underbelly to the sun, and forced it into neat, obedient rows, it would reward you. He had spent 52 years fighting the soil. The soil fought back. It blew away in the dry winds of July. It compacted into concrete under the weight of the tractor. Eventually, the fight stopped his heart right out in the middle of the south pasture. He left Sophie a stack of letters from the bank, a rusty truck, and 20 acres of exhausted, lifeless dirt. Tractor broke, little girl. Sophie turned. Tom Hendricks was leaning heavily against the barbed wire fence that separated her property from his. Tom was a third-generation farmer, with hands like cured leather, and a mind that hadn't accepted a new idea since 1985. His fields were already a pristine, uniform beige, not a weed in sight, just miles of pulverized earth waiting for seed. "Tractor's fine, Tom," Sophie said, wiping grease from her palm onto her denim jeans. "You're burning daylight," Tom said, spitting a dark stream of tobacco juice onto the gravel. "Ground's ready. Supposed to be a dry spring. You want to get that crust broken up before it bakes." "I'm not ploughing this year," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. Tom stopped chewing. He stared at her, his eyes narrowing under the brim of his sweat-stained cap. He looked past her, toward the 20 acres. It was a mess. Last year's corn stalks were still standing, grey and brittle. Beneath them, a chaotic tangle of winter rye and hairy vetch was pushing through the surface. It looked abandoned. It looked like failure. "You're not ploughing," Tom repeated, the words rolling around his mouth like a bad taste. "Arthur passing just break your spirit, Sophie? You can't just let a field go feral. The weeds'll choke out any seed you put down. You're gonna lose the farm." "I'm planting directly into the stubble," Sophie said. She didn't expect him to understand. She barely understood it herself, relying entirely on late-night reading and a desperate instinct to do the exact opposite of what had killed her father. "The roots hold the soil together. The cover crop keeps the moisture in." Tom let out a bark of laughter that sounded like an engine backfiring. "Moisture? Sophie, it's dirt. It ain't a sponge. You don't turn it over, the roots got nowhere to go. You're acting like a damn hippie. This is Oakhaven. We farm proper here." He pushed off the fence, shaking his head. "You need help, you call me. I'll bring my rig over and tear that mess up for you. Won't even charge you for the diesel out of respect for your dad." "I'll be fine, Tom." He got into his heavy-duty Ford, slamming the door. The truck kicked up a plume of white dust as it sped away, a perfect visual representation of the valley's problem. The soil was so dead, so pulverized, that it floated away on a breeze. By noon, the whole town knew. Down at Miller's Diner, the local headquarters for agricultural gossip, Sophie was the main event. John Miller, wiping down the laminated counter, shook his head. Girls lost her mind. Grief does strange things, John said, pouring black coffee into a thick ceramic mug for Will Stanton, who farmed the acreage north of the river. Will snorted, stirring sugar into his cup. Grief didn't make her lazy. 19 years old. Probably wants to sit inside on her phone all day instead of pulling a 12-hour shift on a tractor. Calling it conservation. I call it quitting. Arthur would be spinning in his grave, an old man in the corner booth muttered, leaving corn stalks in the ground. It's an eyesore. It's going to harbor pests, moths, beetles. They'll breed in her trash and fly over to our fields. Sophie heard about the diner talk. In a town of 600 people, gossip had a half-life of about 10 minutes. She didn't care. Or rather, she cared, the cynical laughter burning a hot, tight knot in her chest. But she didn't let it change her mind. She walked her field that evening. The sun was dipping below the ridge, casting long, skeletal shadows from the dead corn stalks. The wind was picking up, carrying the familiar, gritty sting of topsoil from Tom Hendricks's perfectly tilled land. Sophie knelt in the middle of her messy, unplowed field. She dug her bare fingers into the earth. It was hard going at first, pushing past the decaying residue of last year's harvest and the thick green mat of the cover crop. But an inch down, her fingers found something miraculous. Moisture. The dirt wasn't powder. It was aggregated, clumpy, clinging to the deep, fibrous roots of the rye. It smelled rich. It smelled like the floor of a deep woods, earthy and alive, not like the sterile baking powder dust of the neighboring farms. She pulled up a handful and squeezed it. It held its shape. A worm wiggled from the center of the dark clump, falling back into the tangle of roots. Sophie wiped her dirty hands on her jeans and looked toward the horizon. The sky was an unforgiving, cloudless blue. The weather report promised weeks of heat. Let them laugh, she thought. July arrived with a cruelty that Oakhaven hadn't seen in a decade. The heat didn't just radiate from the sun, it baked upward from the ground. The valley became an oven. Weeks passed without a drop of rain. The creek that bordered the eastern edge of town shrank to a trickle, then to a string of stagnant, muddy puddles. For the traditional farmers, the drought was a slow-motion disaster. They had plowed deep in the spring, breaking the earth into a fine powder to prepare the perfect seedbed. They had planted their rows of soybeans and corn with laser precision, but without rain, the pulverized soil had nothing to hold it together. Every afternoon, when the dry thermal winds whipped through the valley, the sky turned a hazy, sickly yellow. Tom Hendricks's topsoil, the nutrient-rich layer his grandfather had bragged about, was quite literally blowing away. It coated the hoods of cars in town. It gritted between people's teeth when they walked to the post office. His corn, planted in naked baking dirt, was stunting. The leaves curled inward like rolled cigars, desperately trying to conserve water. The stalks were yellowing at the base. Right next door, separated only by a line of rusting barbed wire, Sophie's field was an entirely different universe. It wasn't a neat, uniform green. It was a chaotic riot of textures. She had rolled down the cover crop, crushing the tall rye and vetch into a thick mat, and drilled her seeds directly through the dead vegetation. The decaying plant matter acted like a heavy blanket over the soil. It blocked the blistering sun from baking the earth. It stopped the wind from stealing the dust. When you drove past Tom's farm, the heat shimmered violently off the bare dirt, distorting the horizon. When you drove past Sophie's, the air felt calmer. But a town built on tradition doesn't easily admit when it's wrong. Instead of curiosity, Sophie's resilience bred resentment. "It's a fluke," Will Stanton declared loudly in the aisle of the hardware store one Tuesday morning, making sure Sophie could hear him from the plumbing section. She's got a lower water table on that side of the ridge. That's all. It's just dumb luck. Sophie picked up a box of washers and walked to the register. Will was standing there, arms crossed over his plaid shirt, looking at her with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "You know, Sophie," Will said, lowering his voice to a patronizing hum. "That thatch you've got out there, it's a fire hazard. One spark from a passing truck, and your whole 20 acres goes up like a matchbook. Takes out Tom's fence, too." "The thatch is damp underneath, Will," Sophie said, setting the washers on the counter and pulling a crumpled 20 from her pocket. "It's holding water. It won't burn." "Nothing's holding water in this heat," the clerk muttered, ringing her up. "Creek's dry. Ground's cracked wide open. I dropped a wrench in my field yesterday. Fell right into a crack in the dirt so deep I couldn't see it." "Mine isn't cracked," Sophie said quietly. Will laughed, a dry, harsh sound. "Sure it isn't. You keep playing in your weeds, little girl. When harvest comes, we'll see who's taking grain to the elevator and who's facing foreclosure." Sophie took her change and walked out into the blinding glare of the street. The hostility was exhausting. She was tired of the whispers, tired of the side-eyes, tired of defending her right to simply exist on her own land without destroying it. She drove her beat-up truck back to the farm. She parked near the machine shed and walked out into the crops. The heat was suffocating, thick and heavy. But as she stepped off the gravel and into her field, the temperature seemed to drop a few degrees. The thick layer of decaying rye crunched softly under her boots. She walked out to the center of the 20 acres and knelt down. She pushed her hands through the thick blanket of dead cover crop and touched the soil. It was cool. It was dark. She dug her fingers in. The earth gave way, crumbling beautifully, held together by a vast, invisible architecture of roots and fungal threads. It was holding its breath. It was surviving. She stood up and looked at Tom's field. It was a wasteland of pale dust and dying, curled corn. Deep fissures ran through the earth, gaping wounds inflicted by the sun. Then she noticed the sky. In the far west, behind the jagged line of the mountains, the horizon wasn't blue anymore. It was a bruised, heavy purple. The air was perfectly still. The relentless dry wind that had scoured the valley for a month had suddenly died. The silence was absolute. No birds, no crickets. Even the distant hum of the highway seemed to have been swallowed. Sophie felt a strange popping sensation in her ears. The barometric pressure was plummeting. She looked back at the western sky. The purple bruise was spreading, pushing upward, boiling into towering anvils of black and charcoal. At the base of the clouds, the color was terrifying, a sick, bruised green. A low rumble vibrated through the soles of her boots. It wasn't sound. It was feeling. For 30 days, the men in the diner had prayed for rain. They had cursed the clear skies and begged for a storm to save their dying crops. But looking at the bruised, towering violence building over the ridge, Sophie knew what was coming. The earth was baked hard as ceramic. The creeks were empty. The neighbors' fields were stripped bare, pulverized into powder, completely devoid of anything to anchor them. They had prayed for water, but this wasn't going to be rain. This was going to be an execution. A single, massive drop of water fell from the sky, hitting the dusty hood of her truck with a sound like a gunshot. Sophie turned and ran for the house. The sky didn't open. It collapsed. There was no build-up, no gentle warning shower to soften the baked earth. The storm slammed into Oakhaven Valley like a physical blow. The wind hit the side of Sophie's farmhouse with enough force to rattle the plates in the kitchen cabinets. Then came the rain. It didn't fall. It drove sideways in gray, violent sheets, hammering the siding and deafening the world in a continuous, deafening roar. Sophie stood in her darkened kitchen. The power had flickered and died minutes after the first thunderclap. She wiped a circle of condensation from the window above the sink and stared out into the chaos. Every flash of lightning illuminated a landscape that was rapidly tearing itself apart. She watched Tom Hendricks's field. For a month, that ground had been baked into a fine, sterile powder. When the massive raindrops hit that exposed dirt, the physics of disaster took over. The impact of the water acted like tiny bombs, shattering the fragile dust particles on the surface. Within minutes, the rain had sealed the pores of the dirt, creating a slick, concrete-like crust. The soil couldn't drink. The water had nowhere to go. By the time the second inch of rain fell, sheet flow began. A shallow, fast-moving layer of water built up across Tom's 20 acres. It started moving downhill, gathering speed. As it moved, it cut. The water found the natural depressions in the plowed dirt and carved them out, stripping away the topsoil Tom's grandfather had spent decades cultivating. Through the strobe light flashes of lightning, Sophie saw it happening. The water on Tom's side wasn't clear. It was a thick, violently churning brown slurry. It was liquid earth. The runoff hit the shallow ditch separating their properties. The ditch filled in less than 10 minutes. The muddy torrent violently ripped through the dried stalks of Tom's dying corn, snapping them flat, burying them under suffocating layers of silt. Sophie gripped the edge of the sink. Her knuckles turned white. The water was rising fast, and it was spilling over the ditch, rushing violently toward her property line. She waited for the washout. She waited for the flood to hit her field and strip away her seeds, her cover crop, her reckless gamble. The brown wave breached the property line, carrying with it uprooted corn stalks, gravel, and a soup of stolen topsoil. But when the water hit Sophie's field, it hit a wall of resistance. The heavy, matted blanket of dead rye and vetch broke the water's momentum. The kinetic energy of the flood dissipated as it tangled with the thick thatch. Beneath the surface, the unplowed soil was a vast subterranean sponge. Millions of microscopic pores, left intact by the absence of the plow and held open by the deep, decaying roots of the cover crop, sucked the water downward. The rain hammered her 20 acres just as mercilessly as it hammered Tom's. But there was no crust. There was no sheet flow. Sophie pressed her face against the cold glass. The water was pooling in the lowest spots. Yes, but it wasn't running. It wasn't cutting. The earth was drinking it in, fast and deep. Then, the valley's geography surrendered. The dry creek bed on the eastern edge of town, which had sat empty for 30 days, received the runoff from 1,000 acres of heavily tilled, sealed-off farmland. A flash flood roared down the channel. Sophie heard it over the storm, a deep, grinding rumble like a freight train. The creek didn't just overflow, it exploded out of its banks. The dark water surged across the county road, tearing chunks of asphalt away as if they were wet cardboard. It ripped out fence posts, tangling miles of barbed wire into twisted steel nests. For 3 hours the storm relentlessly punished the valley. Sophie didn't move from the window. She watched the lightning eventually move east, the thunder dulling to a low, distant artillery fire. The rain slowed to a heavy, steady drumbeat on the tin roof, and finally, to a quiet drizzle. She stood in the dark, listening to the rushing water outside. The old men at the diner had prayed for this. They had begged the sky to break the drought. They had forgotten that dead soil can't drink. Dawn broke cold and grey. The oppressive heat of July was gone, washed away, and replaced by a damp, heavy chill. Sophie pushed the front door open. The wood swelled from the moisture, scraping against the frame. She stepped onto the porch and breathed in. The air smelled of bruised ozone, crushed vegetation, and raw, exposed mud. The valley was silent. It was the stunned, breathless silence of a disaster zone. She pulled on her rubber boots and walked down the driveway. The gravel was entirely gone, washed into the county road, which was currently under 2 feet of slow-moving brown water. A sheriff's cruiser sat idling on the far side of the washout, its red and blue lights flashing uselessly against the morning fog. Sophie turned back and walked toward the property line. Tom Hendricks was already there. He was standing 20 yards into his field, or what used to be his field. Sophie stopped at the ruined fence line and just stared. It was a moonscape. Deep, jagged gullies, some of them 3 feet deep and wide enough to swallow a tractor tire, crisscrossed the 20 acres. The neat, laser-straight rows of corn were gone. In their place were vast, suffocating mud flats where the heavier sand and silt had dropped out of the water. The rest of the topsoil, the rich, dark, organic matter that actually grew the food, was gone. It had washed into the ditch, across the road, and down into the river miles away. Tom wasn't moving. He stood with his hands on his hips, his boots sinking deep into the grey, lifeless sludge. He looked small. His shoulders sagged under the weight of a heavy, damp canvas jacket. Sophie didn't say anything. She stepped over a downed strand of barbed wire and walked into her own field. The ground beneath her boots was soft, but it didn't give way. She didn't sink. The mat of crushed rye was coated in a thin layer of brown silt that had washed over from Tom's side. But the structure held. She crouched down. She pushed her bare hands through the wet thatch. The soil beneath was saturated, heavy, and cool. It hadn't washed away. The root architecture of her cover crop had locked the earth in place, like steel rebar in concrete, and pushing up through the damp, decaying mat, bright and aggressively green, were her crops. They had taken a beating from the wind, leaning heavily to the east, but they were rooted deeply. They were drinking. They were alive. She heard the heavy suction of boots pulling through mud. Tom had waded his way over to the fence line. He stood there, gripping a wooden post that had miraculously survived the torrent. His face was drawn, deeply lined with exhaustion and a sudden, violent realization. He looked at the deep erosion canyons destroying his family's land, and then he looked at Sophie's flat, green, unplowed field. For a long time, the only sound was the drip of water off the brim of Tom's cap. "Seed's gone," Tom said. His voice was hoarse. It lacked the booming, arrogant cadence he used at the diner. It was hollow, washed clean out. Fertilizer, too. It's all sitting in the county culvert. Sophie stood up. She wiped the wet soil from her hands onto her jeans. "I'm sorry, Tom." "Don't be," he muttered. He let go of the post and scrubbed a hand over his face. He looked out over his ruined acreage again. "Insurance will cover the crop, but it won't replace the dirt. My granddad pulled stumps out of this field. Took him 10 years to build the topsoil. Gone in 3 hours." He turned his eyes back to Sophie. There was no patronizing glare, no snide remarks about her age or her methods. "You didn't lose an inch," he said. It wasn't a question. "The roots held it," she said quietly. Tom nodded slowly. He kicked at a clot of mud that had gathered on the bottom wire of the fence. "Arthur always said you had a stubborn streak. Said once you got an idea in your head, a team of mules couldn't pull it out. He told me I was ruining his farm," Sophie said, the memory tightening her chest. "He was scared," Tom said, looking directly at her. "We're all scared, Sophie. We do things the way our fathers did them, because if we change, and it fails, then it's our fault. If we do it the old way and it fails, well, we can just blame the weather." A heavy diesel engine grumbled in the distance. Will Stanton's massive pickup truck was slowly crawling down the opposite side of the flooded county road. He parked on the pavement, stepped out, and stood staring at the washout. Then he looked up the hill. From the road, the contrast was violently undeniable. On the left side of the fence, a muddy, scarred wasteland of agricultural ruin. On the right, a resilient green field anchoring the earth to the bedrock. Will didn't yell. He didn't wave. He just stood by his truck, staring at Sophie's unplowed 20 acres, doing the brutal, silent math in his head. Tom cleared his throat. "I got a rig stuck up near the barn. Mud's up to the axle. I'm gonna need to winch it out." "Let me know if you need a hand," Sophie offered. Tom managed a tight, exhausted smile. "I think you've done enough work for one season, kid. You let that field be." He turned and began the long, agonizing slog back through the deep mud of his own making, head down, fighting the earth for every step. Sophie watched him go. She felt a cold breeze cut down through the valley, stripping the last of the fog away. The morning sun finally broke through the grey overcast, casting long, sharp shadows across the farm. She walked back to the centre of her 20 acres. The air smelled incredibly clean. She knelt down once more, burying her hands into the damp, living soil. It was cool. It breathed. It held together. Her father had spent his entire life fighting this dirt, trying to break its spirit, trying to force it to yield. He died in the dust, defeated by the very thing he sought to control. Sophie pulled a small clod of earth up and held it in her palm. The roots were visible, woven tightly through the dark loam, holding everything perfectly in place. She didn't fight the earth. She simply gave it armor, and when the flood came, the earth protected her back. She let the dirt crumble gently back onto the ground. The old men at the diner wouldn't laugh today. Tomorrow, they might still grumble over their black coffee, and they might still complain about her messy field. But they would look at her yields come harvest. They would look at their own scarred land. And eventually, they would put the plows away. Sophie stood up, the sun warming the back of her neck. She had 20 acres of crops to tend, and for the first time since her father died, she felt like she wasn't just surviving. She was farming. If Sophie's fight against the flood changed how you look at the ground beneath your feet, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who appreciates the quiet strength of doing things differently. The earth doesn't need to be broken to give us life. Sometimes it just needs us to get out of its way. Drop a comment below. What old tradition are you bravely leaving unplowed in your own life?